We are very excited that you and our guest speaker are here tonight. Tonight's event would not be possible without the assistance of our many co-sponsors, and I want to call them out because they make these kinds of events possible, and that includes the Hightower Fund. It includes the Department of German Studies, the Department of Religion, the Department of History, the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, and the Emory University Jewish Life Chaplaincy. So we had a lot of support to mount this, and I would be remiss if I didn't also call out our TIJS office staff, who has done a spectacular job in organizing this event, the dinner that preceded it. Please recognize Brent Buckley, Paul Entis. They're carrying in extra chairs as we speak. And for those of you who may not be as aware of what the Tenenbaum Lecture is, the Tenenbaum Family Lectureship in Judaic Studies salutes the family of the late Meyer W. Tenenbaum, who was class of 31 college, class of 32 Emory Law School. He was from Savannah, Georgia. Originally, Meyer Tenenbaum was a native of Poland, and he arrived in the United States at age 13, knowing not one word of English. And he graduated from the Emory School of Law 11 years after his arrival. And in 1939, he married LaBelle Birnbaum, who was a native of New Britain, Connecticut, and she was a graduate of Russell Sage College in Troy, New York, and they had 3 children, Davida, Samuel, and Karen. And I have to tell you, Meyer loved Emory, and he credited it for much of the good fortune that he achieved during his lifetime. Meyer passed away in 1986, and the Tenenbaum family at that time established a full scholarship at the Emory Law School in his memory. And LaBelle Birnbaum Tenenbaum passed away in 2001, and she is memorialized through the TAM Institute's LaBelle Birnbaum Tenenbaum Enrichment Fund. And this Tenenbaum lecture honors the entire family and its ethos of citizenship, public service, which is expressed through the support of religious, educational, social service, and arts institutions wherever family members reside today. And Samuel graduated with a degree in history from Emory College in 1965, Meyer's son. And unfortunately, Samuel and his wife Inez, who normally are always here every year, they were unable to attend this year. But we certainly celebrate their deep, deep connections to Emory and the TAM Institute. So now I'm going to turn the microphone over for some words from our college dean, Dean Barbara Krauthammer. For those of you who may have come from the community and are not as familiar with who's who here at Emory, Barbara Krauthammer became Dean of Emory College of Arts and Sciences in 2023, so fairly recently. And she's a widely recognized historian of African American slavery and emancipation in the United States. And her PhD in that field is from Princeton. And I would also just add briefly that Dean Krauthammer is a co-primary investigator of Emory's Mellon Foundation grant, helping faculty redesign humanities courses to emphasize their relevance. So without further ado, please welcome Barbara Krauthammer to the podium.
Thank you. I've been sitting up in the front and didn't get to see everybody come in. Good evening. It's really a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Emory College of Arts and Sciences. It's a pleasure to be in this room and just share in this community experience and this opportunity to learn and think and reflect together. I think moments of like this kind of fellowship that we can enjoy together are increasingly precious these days and really the hallmark of what makes Emory so special. Like my colleague, Professor Gold, I want to begin by thanking Samuel Tenenbaum and his family for their longstanding commitment to Emory and to this program in particular through their generosity of an endowment gift made in honor of the late Meyer Tenenbaum. Their endowment gift and their generosity allows us to offer this program, the Tenenbaum Family Lecture, annually. The program began in 1997, making this the 28th annual Tenenbaum Family Lecture at Emory. And I would say that the program stands out really as one of the highlights of Emory's academic year. Notably, the event, the Tenenbaum Family Lecture, is a great example of the ways in which Emory is committed to engaging the wider community beyond the limits of our campus, but really strives to draw on our community partnerships to build those relationships and to include our wider community in the intellectual life of Emory University. And it's through those community partnerships that really creates what I think is the truly vibrant intellectual community that we have here on campus. So tonight we have the opportunity to learn, to think, and to reflect on fields of inquiry. Over the years, Tenenbaum Family Lectures have ranged across the disciplines from the study of language to literature, sociology, history, and religion. Tonight, we'll hear the lecture on Israel and the Holocaust, Changing Landscapes of Memory. And here I want to point as a real important note to highlight Emory's commitment to Holocaust studies. And particularly, I'd like to note the leadership of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies as a critical partner in sustaining that commitment at our university. So I just want to end now once more with thanking all of you for being here and joining us tonight. And I will now turn things back over to the interim director of the TAM Institute, Hazel Gold, who will introduce tonight's scholar, our lecturer, and proud Emory alum, Professor Avi Patt.
Thank you, Dean Krauthammer. We appreciate your being here. And I just want to add a little bit more to let you know about tonight's lecture. The lecture this evening that you will hear is serving as a keynote to a regional conference that's occurring on our campus, offered in partnership with the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University, or HEFNU. And they are convening here for 3 days, talking about issues of Holocaust education. There are 20 participants featured in this conference, along with faculty. And the theme is Holocaust Memory in the 21st Century. And I would like to now give another shout out and hope you will also recognize our visiting assistant professor, Alicja Podbielska, who has done an astounding job in organizing both the conference and identifying Professor Patt as our speaker this evening. So where are you, Alicja? And so just a couple more words. Dr. Patt arrived at NYU in 2024 as the Maurice and Corinne Grinberg Professor of Holocaust Studies, and also the Ingeborg H. and Ira Leon Rennert Director at the NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Previously, he was on the faculty at the University of Connecticut and the University of Hartford. He is a prolific author. If you go to Amazon, you will see many, many books. His most recent, which was published just last year, is titled Israel and the Holocaust, published by Bloomsbury Press as part of its Perspectives on the Holocaust series. And as Dean Krauthammer mentioned, this is the 28th iteration of this lecture, but the very first time that our guest speaker is an Emory College graduate. So how about that? And Professor Patt graduated from the college in 1997 before the TAM Institute was even founded. So he was a BA in the religion department with a concentration in Judaic studies. And people listen up, he met his wife, Ivy, on this campus. Okay? So with no further ado, because I know you don't want to hear me, you're here to hear the speaker. I'm going to turn the podium over to Professor Avinoam Patt, and he will be presenting his lecture. I think you saw the title earlier, Israel and the Holocaust, Changing Landscapes of Memory.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's such an honor for me to be here, and such an honor for me to be the first Emory alum to be delivering the Tenenbaum lecture. Sorry, I'm just going to switch to this slideshow. 1 second. Okay, there we go. So before I begin, let me just again say what an honor it is for me to be here, and on a number of levels, both to hear sort of to see the wonderful company that I'm in with the past Tenenbaum family lecture speakers, and to hear the story of the Tenenbaum family and how much Emory meant to them and how much Emory Law School meant to them. And I want to mention that my niece Ellie is here, who is a student at Emory Law. So it's very cool to hear that connection. And then I'm also delighted, and I want to thank Alicia for inviting me as part of the Holocaust Educational Foundation's Regional Institute. So it's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues who are participating in the Regional Institute. And thank you for inviting me to deliver the keynote lecture as part of this. But especially, it's really a thrill for me to be back at Emory. I guess I'm aging myself by saying that I graduated before there was a TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. But to see my first professor in Jewish history, Michael Berger, who was my advisor, to be here. So thank you so much. And to learn when I was here at Emory that one could take one's love for Jewish history and turn it into a job, right? So it's really an honor and a thrill for me to be here and be able to deliver this lecture this evening. So you're going to see I have a lot of slides, which I'm going to go through very quickly, and I have assured my host not to be alarmed by the length of the slideshow. But because I'm going through very quickly, there might be things that you see that you're curious about, and you say, "Oh, why did he skip past that?" And please feel free to ask me about the intriguing images in the Q&A. So Israel and the Holocaust. As a scholar who examines both the connections between the aftermath of the Shoah and the creation of the State of Israel and the history of Israel's relationship to the memory of the Holocaust, I have been struck by the many comparisons made between the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023 and the Holocaust. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these. These include the statement that October 7th was the deadliest attack against the Jewish people in a single day since the Holocaust, alongside comparisons of the massacre to Babin Yar and the onslaughts of the Einsatzgruppen. Sorry, just make sure. Okay. It is not uncommon to hear Israelis describe the events of October 7th as a Shoah. And here you can see a testimony collected by a Holocaust survivor who lived through October 7th, who described this day as a Shoah. Or, in contrast, specifically to have people reject the idea that October 7th could be compared to the Shoah. After all, if we think about numerically, it would take 5,000 days like October 7th to equal 6 million Jews murdered during the Shoah. Or even more recently, I'm sure we're all familiar with the release of hostages extremely malnourished, the comparisons to prisoners liberated from camps. We heard this quite frequently. But I started writing this book several years ago. And in fact, I received the final page proofs on October 9th, 2023, so just 2 days after that horrible day, when the editors tell you that you cannot make any more changes to the book, which meant that I was going through the page proofs, the final proofs, already thinking about what the next chapter would be or the next version of the book might be. But even though this book was written before October 7th, the central guiding question has in some way become even more amplified. Why does the Holocaust, or the Shoah, occupy an increasingly central role in the collective memory of Israel, even as distance from the historical event grows? Beyond frequent political invocations of the Shoah, mandatory educational trips to Poland, and the prominent place accorded to Israel's Holocaust Memorial Museum Yad Vashem as a destination for all political dignitaries, survey data also points to the conclusion that more Israeli Jews identify, quote, remembering the Holocaust as an essential part of their Jewish identity than any other category. And this is from a Pew Foundation study comparing same results to American Jews. The proximity between the end of the Holocaust in 1945 and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 seems to suggest a causal relationship between the two events. Some contemporary observers saw theological and historical links. As many scholars have noted, for Holocaust survivors after the liberation from Nazi rule, creating a Jewish state in the land of Israel was, quote, taken to be the last will and testament bequeathed by the dead to the living. While the Zionist project also signified the warmth, unquestioning acceptance, and security of home, and the only real hope for the rescue and rehabilitation of the little that remained of European Jewry, and in the longer term, the promise of the Jewish future. You can see here a program cover from the DP camps of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the spring of 1948, the broken tree of European Jewry, out of which grows a map of actually partitioned Palestine. This is spring of 1948. Accordingly, from its inception, the State of Israel presented itself as a place of refuge for survivors. Israel's Declaration of Independence, read by David Ben-Gurion on May 14, 1948, after listing the centuries-long historic associations of the Jewish people to the land, asserted that the Holocaust was, quote, another clear demonstration of the urgency of the reestablishment in Eretz Yisrael of the Jewish state. In the self-understanding of many survivors, as well as the founders of the state, sovereignty was an uplifting, redemptive legacy of World War II, engaging the Jewish people in a journey from catastrophe to rebirth, from crisis to redemption. But at the same time, for Palestinians for whom the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, began with the founding of Israel and the subsequent 1948 war, also, we see this link of Israel to the Holocaust, claiming in many contexts that the international community gave the Jewish people Israel as a compensation at the expense of Palestinians who paid the price for what Germany did to European Jews. This claim, popular throughout parts of the Muslim world, is often linked to outright Holocaust denial and the negation of Israel's right to exist. And so you can see, for example, perhaps most prominently, the Iranian Holocaust cartoon contest, which often sort of deny the right of Israel to exist by associating it with the Holocaust. It is striking then that both friends and foes of Israel alike argue that Israel was founded because of the Holocaust. But a closer analysis of the years 1945 to 1948 indicates that the State of Israel was founded almost in spite of the Holocaust. As the genocide had obliterated European Jewish civilization, also the main reservoir of human resources for a yishuv facing a steep demographic challenge. And this was the situation that the yishuv confronted at the outbreak of the war and again at the aftermath and the end of the war. So we could say that without the single-minded dedication of yishuv leadership to the creation of a state and the continued failure to solve the Jewish refugee crisis in the aftermath of the war, the State of Israel may not have come into existence. The Zionist movement had pursued the goal of state sovereignty long before the Holocaust, but the European Jewish catastrophe enhanced the determination to seek sovereignty over a piece of land, no matter how small, because a Jewish state was now deemed an existential necessity. World War II also convinced many Jews in the diaspora, especially in the United States, which now had the largest Jewish community in the world, of the need for a Jewish state. But the truth is, if we look at the situation that existed in post-war Europe after the liberation of the camps, ultimately the founding of Israel resulted from realpolitik decisions of the international power players of the day. While the British wanted to leave Palestine as fast as possible since their empire was collapsing, the Americans sought to find a settlement for the 250,000 Jewish displaced persons in their occupation zones in Germany and Austria. And here you can see, this is something that I've spent a lot of time writing about, the situation of the survivors in the aftermath of the war. And I'd be happy to go back to talk about sort of the links between the Zionist enthusiasm of the surviving population and the decisions that led to diplomatic support for the creation of the state. Indeed, the Harrison Report of August of 1945, Earl Harrison had been sent by President Truman to assess the situation confronting the surviving population, and in his report of September 1945, accused the American occupation authorities of treating the Jews just like the Nazis treated them, except for not exterminating them. This is what he wrote. He was the first to suggest, how do we solve the problem of stateless Jews? We'll give them 100,000 immigration certificates and allow them to immigrate to Palestine. And subsequently, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry also linked the resolution of Jewish displacement in Europe with immigration to Palestine. However, as the stay of the Jewish DPs dragged on in Europe, we can see the political decisions and the Zionist enthusiasm of the surviving population playing a critical role both in teaching the Yishuv leadership that the survivors could play a part in decisions leading to the creation of the state, and ultimately political demonstrations and manifestations like the Exodus Affair in particular in July of 1947. After the United Nations, the British had referred the problem of Palestine to the United Nations, we see this playing a critical role then in international diplomatic support for decisions leading to the creation of the State of Israel and the endorsement of the United Nations vote for partition of Palestine in November 29th, 1947. But again, this should suggest to us that strategic political decisions at the beginning of the Cold War by both the United States and the USSR, not sympathy or guilt towards the Jews, ultimately led to UN approval of the partition plan, paving the way to the establishment of a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian Arab state. National sovereignty and partition of territories based on nationality, along with population transfers, had been the dominant model of international politics after the Second World War, based on World War I precedents established in the Treaty of Lausanne. And again, this is another image of the Congress of the surviving remnant in the spring of 1948, that image again of the broken tree with the map of partitioned Palestine emerging from it. So even with an indirect causal connection between the Holocaust and Israel's founding at best, it's still safe to say that the Jewish state exists in a conflicted relationship to the traumatic event. On the one hand, from a classical Zionist perspective, Jews are a nation deserving their own nation state just as every other nation. And indeed, as we can see enumerated in the famous story by Chaim Chazaz, the argument that Jews who have come to the land should forget their history, forget the diaspora. By that logic, Israel does not need the Holocaust to justify its existence. And I show you sort of the previous Prime Minister Naftali Bennett at the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, wanting to state very clearly, Israel is ours because it's the Jewish homeland, not because of the Holocaust. And perhaps we can come back to this. On the other hand, Zionism is predicated on the notion that Jewish life in the diaspora was harmful to the Jews and therefore needed to be negated, shlila tagola, negation of the diaspora, since all efforts to achieve full equality and acceptance by the nations of the world would fail. The Holocaust was the ultimate manifestation of that failure. Therefore, the memory of the Holocaust has been a constant presence in Israeli life and is deeply enmeshed within Israeli self-understanding, Israel's relationship to the wider world, its neighbors, the Jewish diaspora, and the Jewish past. And in recent decades, especially since the publication of Tom Segev's the seventh million, there's been a provocative vein of post-Zionist scholarship comfortable in critiquing the historical development of the Zionist movement and the Yishuv leadership, which has critically investigated the Yishuv's responses to the destruction of European Jewry and largely negative attitudes of Israeli society to Holocaust survivors in the first decades of the state. Much of this scholarship has alleged a cynical manipulation of the political memory of the Shoah for the benefit of the state. And so in writing this book, what I set out to do was essentially to look at the literature that's developed over the last 30 years since the publication of Tom Segev's book, to argue that in many ways, Israeli society engaged with Holocaust memory in ways that were not just determined by the political elites, but were also complemented by a broad societal engagement, spearheaded in ways that had not been appreciated largely before by survivors and their families. Therefore, if we go throughout Israel's existence, we can see that there's been an interplay between top-down attempts to control Holocaust memory and bottom-up engagement with it. Through a series of critical moments in Israel's history, we can trace how memory of the Shoah and its centrality to Israel has changed over time as the Holocaust and its survivors have moved from the periphery to the center of Israeli identity. Okay, that's my prologue. So let's look at the first part here, the first chapter in a sense. The memory of the Holocaust as a challenge to Israeli national identity in the years 1948 to 1961. Now, what's interesting is we can see that from the founding and actually the years before the state is created, we see memory of the Holocaust taking a prominent place in public life early on, although there was a constant tension between the crafting of Holocaust memory by the political leadership of the new state, David Ben-Gurion in particular, and the grassroots level activities of survivors who sought to establish themselves there. And I'll skip ahead, but you can see sort of the role that ghetto fighters in particular in the early years of the state, or even before the state played in sort of beginning to share knowledge of what had happened during the war. Those who had spent the war in Palestine only had a limited understanding of the destruction of European Jewry and tended to interpret it through the lens of Zionist ideology, this notion of sheep to the slaughter. Both political leaders as well as the wider public engaged in a polarized discourse that pitted the heroes, in quotes, and the victims against one another. And what I'm showing you here is one of the first dramatic testimonies offered by a survivor to land in the Yishuv. This is Tzivi Lebetkin, one of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, delivering what was an 8-hour testimony at Kibbutz Yagur, in which she shared the story of not only the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but everything that had led up to it. On the one hand, the few surviving Jewish partisans and ghetto fighters like Chaika Klinger, Rushka Korchak, Abba Kovner, who we saw before, Tzivi Lebetkin, and Yitzchak Zuckerman from Warsaw, were welcomed in Israel with great excitement and respect. Their firsthand accounts to members of the political leadership and institutions of the Yishuv received prominent public attention. The Mordim, the resistors, were referred to as Giborim, heroes, and valorized for, quote, having saved the honor, unquote, of the Jewish people. On the other hand, survivors who could not pride themselves in armed resistance met a wall of silence, disinterest, even impatience from veteran Israelis who believed that the majority of European Jews had either collaborated with the Nazis as members of Jewish councils, as ghetto police, as capos, or had gone passively to their deaths, again, like sheep to the slaughter. This view resulted from a number of factors. There was a lack of knowledge of the complex nature of what had happened during the war, as well as this ideological view that saw diaspora Jews as passive and rejected diaspora life. Accordingly, the Holocaust, by this view, was not seen as a crime sui generis, but as just another example of anti-Semitic violence that had been inherent in the condition of galut, the condition of exile that Jews had lived in for centuries, that could only be resolved through national sovereignty for Jews. Lastly, there was a lack of nuance in the perception of the European Jewish catastrophe that resulted, I would argue, from psychological inhibitions. The focus on heroic resistance was a defense mechanism, even for many who lost relatives in the catastrophic struggle with the shock of an event too difficult to confront, along with feelings of guilt and a sense of shame that the Yishuv had not done enough to rescue European Jews. And here you can see an image of the Search Bureau, and we were talking earlier about family reunification efforts. This was a constant presence of everyday life in Israel in the early years of the state. Attempts to reconnect, to find lost family members. Just though at this time that the state in the making was absorbing large numbers of survivors and was assimilating information about the devastating wartime experiences, the country became entangled in an existential military conflict with actually survivors playing a key role in the fighting. Something like 20,000 of the fighters in the Haganah, the Israel Defense Forces, were survivors of the Holocaust, which was about 1/5 of the total force. Yet the contributions that survivors made to the 1948 war did not dispel disparaging opinions about new arrivals from Europe as weak, passive, and confused. Perhaps no event, though, reflected the encounter between the pragmatic approach to mastering the past and the emotional reaction to German crimes than the intense debate over reparations from Germany. And this is a travel document that allows the bearer to travel anywhere in the world except for Germany. This is from 1950. Israeli negotiations with Germany also then reflected an early example of the politicization of Holocaust memory. How would leaders wrestle with the meaning of the Holocaust in both political and economic terms? In the aftermath of the 1948 war and the absorption of hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, including an estimated 500,000 Holocaust survivors by 1960, Israel was on its knees economically. In those circumstances, David Ben-Gurion turned to West Germany to secure money to help the absorption process. Critics of negotiations with Germany argued that any money received from the Germans was, quote, blood money, intended as an expiation for their crimes. Such was the accusation hurled at the government by the opposition parties, led by Menachem Begin's right-wing Cherut party, when the proposed reparations agreement came to the Knesset in 1952. The January 7th issue of Cherut, the publication of the party, called on Israelis to, quote, remember what Amalek has done unto you and take their anger to the streets, labeling the negotiators as traitors, and included artwork and photographs of murdered Jews to remind readers that there could be no reparations for the dead. On January 8th, 1952, as the Knesset debated the proposed agreement, Begin engineered a riot in which over 100 policemen and civilians were injured. Nevertheless, the government entered into negotiations with West Germany. Sorry, this is from the Jerusalem Post that day, which in the context of the Cold War, this is West Germany, was eager to enter the Western Bloc of nations and so had incentive to enter into negotiations. Ultimately, on September 10th, 1952, and you can see a picture, the negotiating representatives signed the reparations agreement in Luxembourg. Moshe Sharet as Israeli foreign minister, Nachum Goldman representing the Jewish Agency and the World Jewish Congress, and Konrad Adenauer as foreign minister and chancellor of the Federal Republic. West Germany committed to supply Israel with goods and services valuing 3.5 billion marks over the period of 12 years. Germany also assured personal reparations to victims and the return of stolen property. And again, it's important to point out this was about lost property, seized assets. This was not a negotiation over the cost of a human life. Against the fierce protest of large segments of the population, the Israeli government at the time made the pragmatic decision that the Jewish people were better served by building the infrastructure of the state rather than letting the past stand in its way. For Adenauer, Wiedergutmachung, making good again, while not popular with German politicians and the German public, offered a path towards joining the West while collectively atoning for the sins of the recent German past. And yet, in the first decade of statehood, Israeli lawmakers cemented and ritualized Holocaust discourse through laws which sought to demonstrate that the new Jew had mastered the diaspora past. And again, in this way, we can see this contestation between how the state wanted to formalize the ways in which Israelis should remember the Holocaust, and we'll see the ways on a grassroots level that survivors wanted to remember. In April of 1951, this is actually a proposal from the war period itself. In April of 1951, the Knesset passed a resolution to establish what was called at the time Yom HaZikaron LaShoah V'Mered HaGetaot, literally a day of remembrance for the Holocaust and ghetto revolts, which they decided would be held on the 27th of Nisan, not specifically on April 19th. The date that had been, and I wrote another book about this, about the afterlife of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. April 19th was the date of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but it was problematic from the perspective of the Jewish calendar because that day was also the first night of Passover in 1943. So the compromise was to schedule Yom HaShoah 2 weeks later, 27th of Nisan, while the uprising was still going on. And yet, by placing Yom HaShoah 1 week before Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, commemorating fallen soldiers leading into Israel's Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, the state established a commemorative calendar that enshrined a national narrative arc leading from destruction to war and finally to national rebirth. In April of 1953, the Knesset named the day Yom HaShoah VeHaGvura, and in April of 1959, it prescribed a specific ritual. So you can see the law from 1959. A 2-minute silence with a siren at sundown and 11 a.m., suspending all work and traffic, commemorative programs at educational institutions and on the radio, flags on government buildings flying half-mast, and a central government-sponsored memorial service at Yad Vashem. Now, of course, why was this necessary? Because there was concern that people were not sufficiently commemorating the day. So you have to come up with a formula to make sure that people commemorate the day in a way that is determined. In August of 1953, the Knesset also decreed the building of the Central Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem, the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority on the western slope of Mount Herzl outside of Jerusalem. This idea, as you saw in the previous slide, had been proposed by Shenhavi in 1942, but now they came back to the idea. Why did they come back to the idea? It would seem that the state wanted to centralize control in a secular memorial and research institution that would be located in Jerusalem. And again, we can see at the time some contestation over memorials, museums, who would have control over memorialization and museum practices. Yad Vashem was not the first Holocaust memorial museum in Israel. Yitzchak Zuckerman, Tzivia Lebetkin, and other members of the ghetto underground had established the Ghetto Fighters House on April 19, 1949, the 6th anniversary of the revolt, near Akko at what is today Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot, the kibbutz of the ghetto fighters. And while Lochamei HaGetaot, the museum that is there, celebrated Jewish resistance, you can see here a picture of another site in Jerusalem called the Holocaust Cellar on Mount Zion, or Martef HaShoah, which constituted a sacred memorial site located as close to the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, as possible in 1949, when Jerusalem was still partitioned. Just out of curiosity, has anybody been to this site? Okay, maybe we'll discuss. It's a very interesting place. We'll discuss it later. This site, with the backing of the Religious Affairs Ministry, survivors created this site as an alternative cemetery for victims of the Shoah who had not been buried. And you can see here ashes with tablets in memory of every city whose residents had been massacred. Reflecting grassroots commemorative practices, survivors brought salvaged artifacts and objects, destroyed Torah scrolls covered in blood, and jars of ashes from camps to be interred at the cellar. The site also possessed a religious character focused on demonstrating that Jews continued religious observance even during the Shoah. Compared to the secular nationalistic mission of Yad Vashem, which drew its image, which drew its authority from the sacred Zionist national space in Western Jerusalem and its proximity to Herzl's tomb and the military cemetery. The Holocaust seller, in the words of Doron Bar, a scholar who's written about this, drew its claim to authenticity from the east, namely from the Temple Mount, the Old City of Jerusalem, and David's tomb, reflecting a conflict between secular and religious Zionist groups. And this is pictures from inside the site. Yad Vashem's approach to the history of the Holocaust also created a sense of alienation among the survivor historians, whose work Ben-Zion Dinur, Israel's education minister and the first director of Yad Vashem, disparaged. Yad Vashem had acquisition documentation collected by historical commissions abroad in the DP camps and elsewhere in Europe, but only employed a few survivors in its library, archives, and testimony department who fought for recognition. Eventually, Dinur would step down from this position in 1959, and survivor historians like Rachel Auerbach would take on a much more prominent role. Even so, in the 1950s, survivor organizations and hometown societies, Landsmannschaften, organized alternative memorial ceremonies to commemorate the destruction of their communities and engaged in the compilation of hundreds of Yizkor books in Yiddish and Hebrew. In fact, if you look, 75% of all the Yizkor books were published in Israel, 62% of them published in Hebrew. Survivors would turn Tel Aviv into a vibrant Yiddish literary center. And actually, these are pictures from the cemetery in Holon, where there are remarkable Holocaust memorials that were created by the Landsmannschaft and the hometown associations from those different towns. This is Piotrków Trybunalski. This is a memorial to Sobibor and Vlodava and other sites. In Tel Aviv, we can see the Yiddish press memorializing destroyed communities, publishing reflections on the Holocaust in literary journals such as the Golden Kate, edited by the poet and partisan from the Vilna ghetto, Avram Sutzkever. Survivors also published fictional accounts of the Holocaust, most notably the novels and novellas that appeared under the nom de plume of Katzetnik, concentration camp inmate in Yiddish, including Salamandra, House of Dolls, and People. Katzetnik, a survivor of Auschwitz, born in Poland as Yechiel Feiner, would change his name to Yechiel Dinur in Israel, but he remained anonymous until the Eichmann trial. The legal realm then in the 1950s, beyond these memorial spaces, the museums, the literary practices, it was actually in the legal realm that we see a public space in which state-sponsored official modes of addressing the Holocaust and its grassroots level counterparts converged. And while the Knesset had passed the Nazi and Nazi collaborators law in 1950 to prosecute Nazi war criminals and those Jews that they had allegedly had helped the Nazis in their genocide as Jewish council members, Jewish police and capos, these laws also reflected a misguided perception that many Jews had survived through collaboration. Between 1950 and 1973, there were 40 trials of survivors for collaboration. Perhaps the most famous, actually not under this law, taking place in the context of the Kastner affair. Kastner, who was a leading Hungarian Zionist leader who had tried to negotiate with Eichmann and others to rescue. I won't go into the details of this in the interest of time, but this was a very prominent discussion that was taking place at the time. Kastner, who rescued 1,700 Jews on the train, but was ultimately found by the judge to have sold his soul to the devil in negotiating with the Nazis and not warning Jews of impending deportations. Ultimately, the case was overturned in the Supreme Court, but not before Kastner was assassinated. Okay, so turning point then, major turning point is in 1961. And it's the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 that changes perceptions of survivors in Israeli society and helps to further a more nuanced historical understanding of the Holocaust itself. Eichmann, who had been kidnapped in May of 1960 in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to Israel, was indicted in February of 1961 and tried between April and August under that same 1950 Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law. He was found guilty and sentenced to death on December 11th, 1961. After his appeals were rejected by the Supreme Court and the President of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, he was hanged on May 31st, 1962, actually the night in between May 31st and June 1st. Holding the trial in Jerusalem, then, was an expression of Israel's sovereignty and self-understanding as the representative of the Jewish people and of the victims of the Holocaust. Beyond establishing Eichmann's guilt, the trial was meant to instruct Israelis about the horrors of the Holocaust and the harmfulness of diaspora life, even as the three judges tried to keep the proceedings at a remove from the political sphere. Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General, constructed a carefully composed case against Eichmann, which encapsulated the history of Nazi mass murder of European Jews in its entirety. And in that respect, we can see the Eichmann trial is really the first Holocaust trial in the history of criminal justice. Unlike previous war crimes trials, where the prosecution based its case on perpetrator evidence and documentation, in this case, Hausner's case was based largely on oral evidence from Holocaust survivors rather than perpetrator documents. Chosen carefully with the help of survivors such as Rachel Auerbach, the director of the Oral History Department and Testimony Collection at Yad Vashem, the life stories of 108 survivor witnesses represented different countries and diverse wartime experiences, establishing a general understanding of the scope and complexity of the Holocaust. Most survivors who took the stand felt empowered by speaking in the names of their murdered loved ones and being listened to for the first time. But many were also tormented by testifying and feared that they would not be believed when trying to relate experiences from over there to those who had only experienced living here. For example, Katsetnik Yechiel Dinor fainted a few minutes into his account about what he called Planet Auschwitz after reiterating that he had pledged to the dead that he would speak on their behalf. Gideon Hausner, who wanted Israelis to be able to empathize and identify with the survivors, presented himself as an advocate for the victims. As he said in his opening address, "When I stand here before you, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers." During the trial, Hausner turned the experiences of individual witnesses into a Jewish national narrative, making the Holocaust a foundational Israeli experience. For example, when he questioned Rivka Yoselevka, who you can see here on the bottom right of the screen, a survivor of an Einsatz group in mass shooting near Minsk, who saw her mother, father, sister, and young daughter, whom she was holding in her arms, murdered, Hausner sought to conclude the testimony with a redemptive coda, asking at the end of her questioning if she now lived in Israel and had given birth to more children. In his concluding argument, he returned to Yoselevska and turned her into a symbol of Jewish survival and rebirth, explaining that in her resurrection from a mass grave, Rivka Yoselevska symbolized the entire Jewish people. The trial received widespread public attention. Ordinary citizens from all walks of life lined up to watch at the Beit Ha'am, a concert hall which was turned into a courtroom and accommodated 750 spectators a day. And scores of people gathered in public places to listen to the broadcast from the tribunal, as there was no television in Israel yet, responding with profound shock and emotional turmoil. Even if much of the testimony legally was not relevant to the prosecution of Eichmann, it had tremendous historical significance. According to Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote about the Eichmann trial as well, the trial, quote, gave a voice to the victims that they had not had before and would compel the world to listen to the story of the final solution in a way that they never had before. Not only did attitudes towards survivors change, but Israelis gained a much deeper understanding of the complexity of the Holocaust, and this complicated what had been a previously polarized discourse about Jewish behavior between armed resistance, passivity, and collaboration. The trial helped Israelis feel more closely connected to their European cousins, based on a realization, as Chania Blanca writes, that only an accident of chronology separated them and no issue of value or quality. The survivor then began to be seen as a bearer of a foundational history, no matter how they had survived or what their politics had been. Yet understanding the scope of death and destruction during the Holocaust also augmented the sense of Israeli vulnerability and fears that catastrophe could repeat itself in Israel's ongoing wars. In the crisis that preceded the Six-Day War of June 1967, when Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser threatened Israel with annihilation, promising to wipe Israel off the map, eventually resulting in the preemptive strike against Egypt and its allies, Syria and Jordan, the memory of the Holocaust formed a critical frame of reference that guided public and political rhetoric, where comparisons of Nasser to Hitler were commonplace. Even after Israel's unexpected military victory, the lessons of the Holocaust continued to resonate as the aversion of Israel's near annihilation seemed to confirm the necessity of a powerful military. Nasser's threats were heard in a different tone by an Israeli public who understood that, quote, the lessons of the gas chamber were that genocide was always possible. These lessons also seemed to guide Israeli foreign policy after the war, as a question of what to do with the conquered land and the millions of Palestinians now living under military occupation began to dominate diplomatic discussions. Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, although a proponent of a peace agreement that would involve some exchange of territory, invoked the memory of the Holocaust in resisting a return to pre-Six-Day War borders for an Israel surrounded by Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. For us, he said, this is a matter of security and principles. The June 1967 map is for us equivalent to insecurity and danger. I do not exaggerate when I say that it has for us something of a memory of Auschwitz. And this formulation of Auschwitz borders, we can probably trace back to this idea expressed by Abba Eban at the time. We see all sorts of then manifestations of this equation then between sort of a redemptive legacy from the Holocaust to the creation of a secure state of Israel. We see it here in the Scroll of Fire that is Natan Rappaport's statue dedicated in 1971 that situates sort of an epic narrative through artwork from the Shoah to the redemption in the state of Israel. Among religious Zionist adherents of the newly formed Gush Emunim, Bloc of the Faithful settler movement, we also see echoes of this, that the conquest of the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, this return of the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, and numerous biblical sites of the Jewish state seem to be playing out on a meta-historical theological level that had post-Holocaust implications. Some even interpreted then the events of 1967 in messianic terms. The PLO's terrorist campaign against Israeli and Jewish targets around the world seemed to only reinforce a feeling in the late 60s and early 70s that the Jewish people continued to dwell alone and must rely on a strong Israel to defend itself. The September 1972 Munich massacre at the Olympic Games, which resulted in the death of 11 Israeli athletes and 1 German police officer, and a botched raid only seemed to heighten such continued parallels. And although Israel emerged victorious from the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, the surprise nature of the attack, heavy Israeli losses at the start of the war, and the dependence on American military support reinforced a sense of Jewish victimhood that had come to occupy a central place in Israeli collective identity. The Yom Kippur War forced Israelis to acknowledge that they had not triumphed over history, piercing the brief aura of invincibility that existed after the Six-Day War, and coinciding with the new interpretation of heroism that was beginning to be transformed in the aftermath of the Eichmann trial. The losses then suffered during the Yom Kippur War, coupled with a shift from a collectivist to a more individualistic ethos and the empowerment of the Mizrahi electorate against the Ashkenazi labor Zionist elite, helped lead to the victory of Menachem Begin and the Likud, who would make ample use of the Holocaust as a justification for Israel's need for sovereignty and deterrent military strength. And I promise this is the last part. Now, after the collapse of the labor governments that had dominated Israeli politics since its founding, the election of Menachem Begin in May of 1977 solidified the memory of the Holocaust as a central cornerstone of Israeli political life and foreign policy. Begin, who had fled the German occupation of Poland to be imprisoned in Soviet forced labor camps in Siberia before coming to Palestine in 1942, lost his brother and his parents in the Holocaust. His entire political career, from the battle against reparations to the anxious period before the Six-Day War, was shaped by the Holocaust, and he did, in the words of Tom Segev, quote, more than anyone else to politicize it. When Begin received the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to achieve peace with Egypt together with Anwar Sadat, he even invoked the Holocaust at the White House peace treaty signing ceremony on March 17, 1979, identifying himself as, quote, one of the generation of the Holocaust and redemption, and one whose parents had sanctified the Lord's name with sacred blood, which reddened the rivers of Europe from the Rhine to the Danube, from the Bug to the Volga. Not just in times of peace, but especially in times of conflict, Begin maintained that precisely because of the Holocaust, the international community had no right to criticize Israel's military actions. This also paralleled a deepening identification with the memory of the Holocaust, not just among survivors and their descendants, but on the part of the broader Israeli public. Starting in 1980, Holocaust education became a required part of the national educational system. The March of the Living and state-sponsored programs to bring thousands of Israeli teenagers to sites of concentration and death camps in Eastern Europe was established in 1988, becoming an initiation ritual for high school seniors before they served in the army, and cementing a sense of existential threat and the need for military strength as well as national pride. At the same time, the 1980s and 1990s saw a plethora of literary, cinematic, artistic depictions of the Holocaust that became an integral part of high school curricula and Yom HaShoah commemorations, or otherwise held a central place in the cultural sphere and the media. The creators were survivors, second generation, their children, those who didn't have a personal connection with the Holocaust. Collective memory of the Shoah thus became a unifying principle for Jews from diverse backgrounds. And the truth is that with the move to the political right, and here you can see the chief rabbi of Israel, Yisrael Meir Lau, who was a child liberated from Buchenwald. With the move to the political right that began with Begin, and especially under Benjamin Netanyahu, Israelis have internalized a much closer relationship to the Shoah, and references to the extermination of European Jews have become commonplace in the political sphere. And so we see it evoked time and again as the relationship to the Arab neighbors is increasingly understood through the prism of the Holocaust. From the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the invasion of Lebanon, the Gulf War, and the Iraqi gas attacks, the First Intifada, the failure of the Oslo Accords, the terrorist attacks of the Second Intifada, protests over the Gaza disengagement, the Second Lebanon War, the present threat posed by a potentially nuclear Iran with repeated threats to wipe Israel off the map, and now in the war with Hamas, we see the Holocaust serving as a reference point that is constantly invoked. Indeed, the memory of the Holocaust has come to be used as a rhetorical tool that assumes great familiarity with the symbols of Jewish weakness during the Holocaust, warning of the dangers of one government policy or another. Thus, for example, opponents of the Oslo peace process, like Moshe Feiglin, charged Rabin is the Judenrat, loading us onto the trains, or leading us like lambs to the slaughter. Likewise, Ariel Sharon, then general in the IDF and former defense minister in right-wing Likud governments, asked in 1994, what is the difference between the Jewish Council in the Ghetto and the Rabin government? There, the Jews were forced to collaborate. Here, the government is doing everything of its own free will. Such incitement, we can argue, would inspire Yigal Amir, in fact, to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995. Nonetheless, even in the aftermath of the assassination of Rabin, we do not see a lessening of such analogies, just a debate over which analogies are accurate and which are appropriate. So, for example, we can see in the dawning of orange stars by opponents of the Gaza disengagement in 2006, ironically pushed forward by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, now became the target of Nazi comparisons by his opponents. And here you can see sort of this famous image adopting the pose of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. And while this is evidence that the Shoah has become crucial to Israeli self-understanding and collective memory, it's also the frame of reference and primary association for most segments of Israeli society and for a new generation of political leaders descended from Holocaust survivors. And there are many of them now, including Merav Michaeli, Benny Gantz, and Yair Lapid, all descended from survivors for whom it is central to their own identities. Yet, at the same time, we can see that the Holocaust memory's use and abuse has become increasingly politicized. And I'll just skip ahead briefly to say that there are many warning against the dangers of this trivialization, superficialization in many different ways, including those like Avraham Borg, who warn about what he sees as a surplus of Holocaust memory. We also see these critiques of the use of cynical manipulation of the memory of the Holocaust for political purposes, finding frequent reference to the memory of the Holocaust also in Israeli humor. So here's an example from a sketch from The Jews Are Coming, Hayudim Ba'im, Final Solution 2.0, in which the organizers of the Eurovision Song Contest are likened to Nazis for not giving Israel enough points in the Eurovision Song Contest. I could go on, but there's lots of examples of this where we see it used in Israeli humor. In this case, Oscar Schindler meets Michael Scott from The Office. Even so, most satirical skits about the Holocaust in Israel do not minimize or trivialize the Shoah, but instead simultaneously reinforce the centrality of the Shoah and its memory in Israeli society, while also in certain ways using humor to critique its instrumentalization and politicization. But we can also see a pushing back against this taking place in the political sphere through more intimate, private, commemorative activities like Zikaron Basalon, memory in the living room, or in historical writing, which asks to discuss the interconnectedness of the Holocaust with other historical events like the Nakba. And this is a poster, so you could still see this is from just before, this is from the protests against the judicial reform, again saying this is leading us to destruction, but evoking the imagery of the Holocaust. Okay, a couple words of conclusion, then I'll wrap up. So regardless of what the historical record suggests about the challenges of drawing a straight line from the liberation of the camps to the establishment of the state in collective memory, the two events, Shoah and Tkuma, become inextricably linked in broad public understanding of history. And as time grows from the event and the last living eyewitnesses pass, memory of the Shoah holds a central place in Israeli collective national identity, and it increasingly becomes the prism through which Israelis understand both their past and the nature of their present relationship with their Arab neighbors and the wider world. Immediately after October 7th, many Israelis began to talk about their traumatic experiences of October 7th through Holocaust references. Some Israeli leaders referred to Hamas as the new Nazis to justify a military operation in Gaza. And Hamas, for its part, having held a genocidal fantasy of wiping Israel off the map since its 1988 manifesto and vowing to repeat October 7th indefinitely, also called the IDF Nazis and Israeli civilians Nazi settlers. Critics of Israel and its military response have also charged Israel with genocide. Again, sort of a loaded use of the term that evokes the memory of the Holocaust. And it's clear that in the aftermath of this catastrophic day and the war that follows, Israel will never be the same. The notion that Israel exists to protect the lives of Jews from murderous violence has been shaken as the state seems to have failed in its mission. And yet it seems clear that for Israelis and many Jews and non-Jews alike around the world, the memory of the Holocaust serves as the strongest reminder for why Israel must exist and defend its citizens. For many Israelis, the atrocities of October 7th will likely cause a deeper identification with the history of Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. And against this context, I am interested, and maybe this will be the next chapter or the next book, and examining how the frameworks of Holocaust memorial culture in Israel and around the world have been and will be deployed in efforts to document and commemorate the October 7th massacre. So we can already see oral history projects like the USC Shoah Foundation's October 7th collection project, or the grassroots Edut 710, collaborative effort to collect testimony modeled more on the Fortunoff Video Archive's approach of Dory Laub to collect testimony from survivors of October 7th. Nonetheless, these rely on existing methodology utilized to record Holocaust survivor testimony. Likewise, so-called October 7th tourism at memorial sites like the Nova Music Festival and Kibbutz Nir Oz or Kibbutz Be'eri cannot again help but evoke visits to sites of destruction in Europe. So what are the implications of this for memorialization and documentation practices? Well, such approaches to documenting and remembering the October 7th attacks continue to solidify the centrality of the Shoah in collective memory as the raison d'etre of the state. Will this bolster a worldview that sees the existence of the state not based in the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel or as a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, but one which argues that the state must exist because Amalek, forces of evil, rear its ugly head in every generation, and that the state must use all means to defend itself regardless of the consequences? Or will October 7th become a new foundational trauma, shaping the worldview of a generation? Such a worldview will have profound implications for the future, including in the nature of Israel's relationships with its neighbors and the rest of the world. The notion that Israel exists to protect innocent Jews from murderous rampages of evil perpetrators may seem to have been shattered, but the never again ethos will likely require a strong, uncompromising response, as we have seen. Likewise, the post-Holocaust model of Jewish resilience will serve as a model for how to emerge from catastrophe, as will existing modes of commemoration and memorialization, which will likely be adapted for the most recent destruction. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Patt for a very detailed, illuminating talk about something that is just in our landscape. It's unavoidable. We have to talk about it. And quite honestly, I mean, I've already seen many examples that you're talking about, a number of films that have come out. We Shall Dance Again, October Hate, set here, about New York City and people tearing down the kidnapped posters, and Dogs and Men, which is a fictional film about a woman who goes searching for dogs of people who were murdered on October 7th, and interestingly shows no violence. It does not have film footage from what happened that day. We know there's a lot of footage from people who were at the Nova Festival, but it was filmed at one of the kibbutzim that was completely overrun and destroyed. So you see that afterwards. So very clearly, this is part of our landscape. And we have about 15 minutes or so, and I can share the mic with anyone who has comments or questions for Professor Patt.
I feel that we've run my concern is, we say, what about October 7th, but what about October 8th? My uncomfortability lies in my Jewishness. The fact that we're ignoring hundreds of thousands of people that have been murdered because of the actions of a few. And my concern is that we are going to excuse the genocidal behavior of Israel against the Palestinian people subsequently since October 7th because of the Holocaust. And to me, that is a disservice and a disgusting way and a disgusting use of Holocaust memory. We can mourn those on October 7th and have humanity and empathy and compassion for the Palestinians who had no responsibility for what occurred to those people. And I just see this distortion of the Holocaust narrative. I'm tired of being called a self-hating Jew. I'm tired of being called a bad Jew because I don't support ethnic violence caused by a state, whether or not. My whole thing is it feels like fear-mongering. Where do we draw the line of saying, okay, We have our trauma, we understand this, but at this point you can't just take on anybody and destroy the whole world because they blinked the wrong direction at a certain point.
Okay, so thank you for sharing that. I mean, I don't want to sort of, and I think just a couple of things, just in terms of thinking about sort of the nature of the response. I mean, we have to be very precise, right, in terms of what we're describing. So, we're talking about sort of the aftermath of October 7th, the war in Gaza, Israel's military response. So it's, as historians, right, it's important for us to be precise. And one of the things is sort of, if we look at the use of the term genocide, so we can see that even sort of the term was being invoked before the military response began. So we have to understand sort of why that term has certain valence, right, as a sort of a critique against the state of Israel, which, I think I've shown sort of the ways in which that happens. And then, we have to think about, I mean, obviously, right, it's very difficult in this circumstance to distinguish between sort of a state actor, and then you have a terrorist organization that's operating from a place where there are, yes, tens of thousands of innocent civilians that end up becoming killed. And part of what I've tried to show is, I think one of the reasons that the state needed to have or felt that it needed to have an overwhelming military response was, yes, the stated goal of destroying Hamas, but also of restoring this sense of, because the state of Israel failed on October 7th to protect its civilians, right? So the response then that was necessitated was to demonstrate, prove that state had the power to protect and defend its civilians. But at the same time, right, like, we have to be precise in terms of and I for one, as a historian who, and will go on record with this, I was critical of some of my colleagues in the field who, already in November of 2023, were sort of saying that this was Omer Bartov wrote in the New York Times, what I believe as a historian of genocide, predicting that there was the potential for genocide to occur before the war even began, but sort of using that as a term to, I think, attack the Israeli government, to criticize Israeli policy, right? And this came in a context of sort of a year of protests against the Israeli government that had began before. And I think as historians, it behooves us, right? Like, we see what we see in this moment. We can go back with the benefit then of history and hindsight, and we'll be able to look back and study the events and try to understand exactly what happened. But also, we don't want to sort of use terms. I bristle at the idea of using this term specifically to refer to the military conflict that took place. I am sure that there are tens of thousands of people who died in a conflict because a war took place in a densely populated urban area. There are going to be, I'm sure, evidence will be proved of what happened. But as historians, we have to be careful, right, about the terms that we use to define something until much later after the fact.
Is it on? Okay. Thanks so much. I thought the concept of the grassroots versus the state promotion of memory practices was really interesting. Also thinking about, the implications of Holocaust comparison to October 7th, but what got me thinking through your presentation was the figures, the figures that kind of became symbols after the Holocaust for Jewish resistance, like Auerbach, like Anna Levitz, but then also those maybe global figures who became symbols of the opposite, like Anne Frank, for example. And it got me thinking a lot about some of the hostages that have become, or arguably have become, these symbols, whether intentionally or not for similar reasons. And some examples I think of are Noah Argamani and the success of her rescue versus the B-bus children, and what they represent. And I know that's a very fresh, it's very fresh, but kind of what they are now and have been representing as, that failure for what Israel was meant to do. And I was just wondering if you had any insight or reflections on the way different hostage figures are kind of being symbolized in similar ways that we've seen. Yeah.
Thank you. So I've been asked to repeat the questions, so I'll
Abbreviated
so
form.
I've suddenly remembered, so I will repeat that question, but I think that's an excellent question. So for the video, the basic, I think what you're getting at is that we can see in the aftermath, like how the Holocaust is remembered in Israeli society. You have certain figures that become sort of the symbols of the type of memory or the type of behavior or activity that become sort of representative symbols that are actually disconnected perhaps from the figure. So, Tzvi Lebetkin, as we talked about, is a perfect example. Or, if I go back here, sorry, going the wrong direction. But if I go back here, like Mordechai Nalevich, right, for example, or the heroic figures of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So the question is, sort of, do we see this parallel process taking place in the aftermath of October 7th? And I think that's you're onto something that is a very interesting question for us to think about how this functions in the present moment, right? Sort of, what are the images of what do people need? Because what we see is that sort of memory is always shaped, and collective memory is always shaped in a dynamic process between the needs of the present and what is available from the past. And that can be political, but it can also be social, cultural needs of the present and what's available from the past. So I think you're right to start to think about, right? Like, who are the symbols? Who are the images? What do people want to see? Do they want to see sort of people heroically emerging from extreme trauma and torture, but having some sense of resilience, right? Is that something that you need? Or I think you evoked Anne Frank, and I actually saw a comparison that was made a couple of days ago between the B-bus children and Anne Frank. And this is, again, right, thinking about sort of what did Anne Frank represent in the aftermath of the Holocaust? And there's actually an exhibit now at the Center for Jewish History where they have taken a replica of the annex and moved it into the Center for Jewish History, and it is sold out through May now, and they've extended it till next February. Like, it's a very popular. So the image of Anne Frank remains sort of a very popular symbolic image onto which to project sort of ideas of what. And so on the one hand, Anne Frank might represent sort of a symbol of innocence, a symbol of belief in humanity. There's something about the innocence of a child and what it symbolizes. So in this case, right, sort of the B-bus children, but it seems like this is functioning in a different way in this moment, right? Where it's kind of it's also something that's used to hold up the inhumanity, the evil that Hamas represents, counterposed to the innocence of the children who are the innocent victims, right? But I think you're asking the right questions then about sort of thinking about how do these symbols, what are the symbols that people need, the symbols that people want to use, and we should be paying attention to these things.
So I think we have time for a lot of hands, but only one more question.
I'm happy if you want to collect also. We can,
Yeah, and there will be a chance to mingle with Professor Patt afterwards. So I'm just going to take the sort of path of least resistance.
Thank you. So we seem to be entering this new era where a Hitler salute has become a fad, and the belief that the Holocaust never happened or has been severely exaggerated is commonplace. What changed, and have we kind of potentially oversaturated the Holocaust memory, or is it being diluted?
Yeah, good question. Okay, and it's a good question, so I will repeat it. Uh, yeah, no, thank you. The question was sort of thinking about things like Elon Musk's Hitler salute, or now sort of the popularity of seeing the Heil Hitler evoked in numerous contexts. What changed? I think is a question. Like, what has happened in this moment that we see it increasingly trivialized or increasingly commonplace? And I think there's a number of things taking place, right? So, in the specifics of this case, I mean, I think there is like a fascination with fascist ideology, with power, with authoritarian regimes. Like there is something very specific going on that that we can see being evoked here. When Musk goes to Germany and sort of says to Germans in the run up to the most recent election that it's okay to forget the past, essentially, that this generation of Germans shouldn't have to pay for the crimes of their grandparents or great grandparents. I think a lot of Germans were quite shocked by that, because Germany has done remarkable work over the last 80 years to essentially wrestle with that past and make it a central focal point of the national identity, to suddenly have the world's richest man say, as a way to try to help this extreme right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany, saying, it doesn't matter. I think it's not. So that is like for specific political reasons. But then to your bigger question, which is kind of what's happening in this moment. So I will go back for a second to where we started, which is that I was a student at Emory, and obviously Deborah Lipstadt was one of my professors. And this was exactly at the time that she had been sued by David Irving. So she just marked, so there was an event in New York on Tuesday marking the 25th anniversary of the end of the Irving trial and her victory. And I think at the time we sort of thought like, okay, this is a moment of a victory for history, right? She won in the trial against the Holocaust deniers. She was essentially, the trial turned into a trial to try to prove the veracity of the Holocaust, right? Which, on the face of it seems absurd, but it was such an important moment that they specifically did not call survivors at that trial, right? They relied on historians, they relied on expert witnesses. They did not want Irving to be able to attack and belittle survivors. But now here we are 25 years later, in a moment where we're fighting for historical truth, we're fighting for evidence, we're fighting for facts, we're fighting for history. And I think, there's a lot of factors that go into that. The last living generation of the eyewitnesses is passing from the earth before our eyes, right? Here we are 80 years after the end of the war. This generation will be the last generation that will live at the same time as the survivors. So that has a great deal of sort of significance. If we think about sort of time goes on and people forget and the evidence is not there. And then we're living through a time where people don't know what to trust or what to believe. The internet has not ushered in an age of information. It's ushered in this age of disinformation, misinformation. And it's the whole enterprise that we're engaged in here of teaching history, of teaching facts, of providing evidence to support arguments that we're making. We're in a very risky time now, but I think this all the more so sort of makes the point of, and listen, universities are also kind of, I think, the bulwark of trying to defend, right, what democracies stand for and the importance of truth in this period in time. And we are also, sort of at risk. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's not just about forgetting. It's not just about the time that it's going on. It's also sort of use of the politics of history as well. So